I'm particularly happy today to be able to introduce a colleague to you with whom I do not only share many fields of interest, but also an apparently similar academic trajectory. My major almost half a century ago at the University of Vienna started with sinology and also a certain degree of Koreanology. And I ended up in digital humanities, as you all know. Dr. Alice Horva received her PhD in East Asian Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago, 2019, and is currently Assistant Professor of East Asian History and Digital Humanities at East Asian Institute of Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. What is very special about her work is the use of very hybrid approaches, combining traditional philology with innovative digital methods. In many parts of her research, she has also been advocating the adoption of non-Western perspectives to thus allow new and more balanced angles on many research questions. What has brought Alice into our focus here has also been the fact that she, while doing research on the mechanisms of transnational flows within and beyond East Asia, with a focus on Japan, China, and Korea, she's also been very active in research infrastructures in recent years. I assume that we will hear today some things about her engagement with DARIA, the digital infrastructure for the arts and humanities, and there about the working group Multilingual Digital Humanities, a group of people aiming at enhancing digitally enabled research in under-resourced languages and linguistic varieties, thus striving for more inclusive toolboxes in the field of the digital humanities. Alice recently co-guest edited a special issue on East Asian Studies and Digital Humanities for the International Journal of Digital Humanities, together with Hilde de Weert, and is co-editorial team member for the DARIA Open Methods project. She also works as a topic editor of the Asian and Asian Diaspora Studies section of Reviews in Digital Humanities, and is a former contributor to the pioneering NEH-funded project New Languages for NLP, Building Linguistic Diversity in the Digital Humanities, organized by Princeton University and DARIA EU. She's also contributed to the volume Global Debates in the Digital Humanities, in which she advocates for more collaboration between scholars conducting digital humanities work in the context of Japan, China, and Korea. She's also a member of the Digital Humanities Japan Network, a regular presenter at Asia-related digital humanities workshops and conferences, and a review of Digital Humanities Quarterly, and the creator and host of the podcast Humanist at thepodcast.com, which explores the role and significance of the humanities in the 21st century. Well, while linguists have been very much at the roots of digital humanities, to my knowledge, the first academic discipline to start working with digital tools and data happened already way back in the 50s and 60s of the last century. There have remained to this date many gaps to be filled in the repertoire of available tools for many languages of this world, about which people like me, working mainly on Middle Eastern and African languages, are painfully aware. Today we will hear a talk under the title Why Does Language Matter in the Digital Humanities? Multilingual Digital Humanities as a Phenomenon in Digital Research and Infrastructures. Alice, the floor's all yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about language as a phenomenon, and more specifically, multilingual DH as a phenomenon in digital research and infrastructures. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today is that I'm going to tell you a story in 3 acts. And these 3 acts, especially the first 2, will correspond to the different stages of a life cycle of a DH project. So basically, the first one is going to be related to reading texts and essentially digitizing texts. And I'm going to connect this to what I would call the individual level. So the concrete project that I'm going to mention is something that's an individually initiated project. And then I'm going to move on to Act 2, which is going to be about the next steps, so processing text, which is something that often and a lot of times happens after digitizing and making a text machine readable. So basically I'm going to be talking about what you do with a corpus after you digitize this, and I'm going to connect this to collaboration on a smaller scale. And finally, I'm going to move on to Act 3, and here we're going to zoom out a little bit to observe the larger DH community and the infrastructural level, and how these two layers can be interconnected towards a linguistically more inclusive DH environment. And I'm going to be talking about some concrete initiatives that aim to make multilingual voices more visible in DH. So you can actually think about these acts as some sort of like a mosaic or pieces of a puzzle. So essentially ways that offer a glimpse into the challenges and realities of making DH work for underrepresented and under-resourced languages and scripts. But before we delve into this, let's start with a brief prologue. Miért fontos a nyelv, mint jelenség a digitális bölcsészetben? A nyelv, mint az önkifejezés eszköze, összeköt, de szét is tud választani. Mert a nyelv ismerete, vagy annak hiánya megnehezítheti a hatékony kommunikációt, és kutatási szempontból a források megfelelő értelmezését. I didn't mean to scare you. But this is a bit of Hungarian, by the way, and you're going to see in a minute why I switched to a different language. But first of all, what I actually said was, why is language important in digital humanities? A language as a form of self-expression can connect people, but can also divide us, because the knowledge of a language, or the lack of it, can hinder the effectiveness of communication and can also make the proper interpretation of sources in a research context challenging. And if we take this a step further, we can think about a question. So what happens when we do have the necessary language skills, but the currently available software cannot process text in that language or script properly? How much meaning gets lost? How many meaningful projects remain thus incomplete or cannot even begin due to the lack of accessible resources that are compatible with that language or script? This sort of lack and incompleteness is something that I believe is similar to the difficulties that we experience when we don't understand everything from a language, and also resembles the current reality of many scholars in DH, because what they often experience is that the computer they want to interact with may have significant problems in deciphering and processing the languages and scripts that these scholars are trying to use. So let's say you're trying to interact with a computer and you upload the text and you want the computer to understand this, but instead the computer only understands this much. And this is what often happens when you try to OCR a Kanban text, which is basically, well, roughly speaking, classical Japanese written in classical Chinese with some reading aids. Now, I will revisit these pages later on in a different context, but I wanted to give you a sense of what many scholars encounter when they see the digital version of the languages they use. And again, before we delve into the three acts, let me also discuss the definitions of multilingual DH. So what do we mean when we talk about multilingual DH, really? And this could be approached from multiple perspectives, but let me provide some points to consider. So, as it was mentioned in the introduction, I'm co-founder and chair of the DARIA Multilingual DH Working Group, and as such, I have noticed that there's a recurring tendency among scholars to consider multilingual DH as the uses of multiple languages simultaneously, which sometimes seems very intimidating to them, and they feel like they don't qualify to become a member because they only use one language in their research. However, in reality, the way we understand this in the working group is that for us, multilingual DH is about inclusion. It's about diversity. It's an opportunity to form a network, to learn from each other and raise awareness of the realities and challenges of doing DH, particularly in the context of under-resourced and underrepresented languages. And by the way, almost all languages beside English and some other somewhat better served languages, almost everything else counts as under-resourced and underrepresented. So, and for us, it's also important to recognize that our experiences are not isolated edge cases. And beside raising awareness, our goal is also to achieve tangible results. But again, this is something that I will return to later in Act 3. In addition, I also see value in drawing attention to two terms that are hidden behind the term multilingual DH. Now, together with my longtime collaborators, Cosima Wagner at Freie Universität Berlin, David Riesli at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and until recently, Cornelis Fallit at Utrecht University. So we all work with non-Latin scripts one way or the other, so Japanese, Chinese, or Korean, and David and Cornelis, they work with Arabic, for example, and to some extent Ottoman and Turkish too. So we have experience dealing with non-Latin scripts in a digital context, and we have formed a scholarly collective to examine the state of affairs of multilingual DH and to raise awareness of the importance of and need for concerted efforts towards equity and access to digital tools and infrastructures from a linguistic perspective. Now, based upon the relevant studies of Paul Spence and multiple linguists, we consider the term multilingual DH on two levels and claim that multilingual DH essentially encompasses two layers, multilingualism and multilinguality, although in other contexts, sometimes people use these terms interchangeably, but we see value in differentiating between the two. Now, for us, essentially, multilingual DH is like a mask. It's like a camouflage for these two terms behind them. So, and here, what we mean by these terms, so multilingualism or official multilingualisms essentially refers to a more top-down approach to language usage from the perspective of a state or a region. So this is basically what happens in countries where there are multiple official languages. On the other hand, multilinguality or scholarly multilinguality is something that we consider to be more relevant to our purposes here, so something that's more relevant to digital humanities, because this reflects the usage of different languages in different contexts for different purposes and sometimes to different degrees. So basically, let's say there's a scholar who's a native speaker of German, who works in a Southeast Asian country, uses Arabic language texts and primary sources and publishes in English. Now, this person may use several languages in parallel, but in different areas of his life, maybe in different registers, and sometimes to a different degree. So, and what we have found is that the currently available digital tools and infrastructures are not necessarily or not always ready to accommodate the needs of the otherwise large number of people with such or similar backgrounds. Again, this is something I will return to later, but in the following, I will focus on showcasing concrete case studies on the significance and realities of multilingual DH. Due to my own background in East Asian studies, I work with Japanese, Chinese, and Korean texts, so I will mostly present examples from my area of study, but I want to emphasize that this is not an isolated example or an edge case, and even if it seems like an edge case, based upon our research, the sum of these edge cases is actually most likely more significant than one might initially think or realize. And come to think about it, this is also a form of multilinguality because I'm going to show you Japanese examples written in classical Chinese, and we'll talk about these sources in English, and I'm a native speaker of Hungarian, and now I'm doing this lecture in a German-speaking country. Yes, so. Okay, now I think we are ready to move on to Act 1, which, as I said, is going to be about reading and digitizing texts in a multilingual context. Now, in the life cycle of a DH project, the initial stage is most likely related to digitization. And by digitization here, I mean making your corpus machine-readable and ready for text analysis. And I'm referring to textual sources. Now, this stage can already present some challenges that may hinder the completion or even the launch of DH projects in languages beyond English. And this is actually one of the reasons why non-Latin scripts, for example, and other underrepresented languages are under-resourced and underrepresented in general in DH, because the digitization process already fails. Now, I recently published a book chapter in Global Debates in the Digital Humanities, where I wrote about the problem of digitization in the context of East Asian studies and identified a phenomenon that I called temporal divide. So basically, what I refer to here is that if you want to digitize specifically Japanese, Chinese, or Korean texts, that depending on whether it's a modern and contemporary text or a non-modern one, you may have a very different kind of experience. So if you want to digitize a modern or contemporary text, you might not have that many challenges actually, whether it's Chinese, Japanese, or Korean, but you might encounter more problems with copyright. Whereas if you're working with non-modern texts, then copyright may be less of an issue, but you might have serious challenges with the technical side of OCRing or HCRing the text that you have. And this can present some serious obstacles, and this also contributes to the underrepresentedness of non-modern source-based projects in DH in East Asian studies. Now, but I also thought that, yes, this is something that's been discussed and mentioned several times, I think, that there are challenges and there is a significant imbalance and inequity when it comes to accessing tools to digitize materials. But I thought I would give you some very concrete examples throughout this entire talk to show you why is it difficult to digitize a text, why is it difficult to process it. So, well, at this stage, I'm going to focus on digitization. So, yeah. Here is this page that I've already shown you in the prologue, a page in Kanbun, which literally means Chinese text or Chinese script. In Chinese, this would be Hanwen. And, well, this is essentially, as I said, classical Japanese written in classical Chinese with reading aids, these miniature marks. And this is something that's not Japan-specific. So the Koreans did this for centuries too. So they also adopted and adapted Chinese, classical Chinese characters, first as a necessity, and after the creation of their own local scripts, the Hangul or the hiragana and katakana system. Then at the same time, this is also a form of prestige and even a status symbol for the elite to use classical Chinese that they associated with China, that was a source of innovation and civilizational items. So basically, but in Korean, this would be Hamwon, the same two characters, by the way. So, and the reason why I'm talking about this is because Kanbun is seriously underrepresented in DH, even though this is very much ubiquitously used in the non-modern period, let's say, or the usage of literary Sinitic, to be more precise. So if you work with non-modern materials, you will likely find these kind of, or you will likely encounter these kinds of texts at some point. And yet, they are underrepresented from the perspective of OCR and HCR. Now, let me give you some concrete points to consider, and maybe if you work with non-Latin scripts, you might relate to these problems too, and maybe we can talk about this later on, but let me give you some concrete problem points that may hinder the digitization of these texts. So first of all, directionality. So as you can see, this is a vertically aligned text, but by the way, even modern Japanese books are often published like this, but you're supposed to read this text from top to bottom and right to left. So but here, some OCR software keep this alignment in the output too, the vertical alignment. Some of them switch to horizontal alignment, which I think for text analysis purposes is not necessarily a problem, but I can imagine that for other users, for example, for those who work with right to left languages, this can present some significant problems and challenges. One thing that I would mention is that I noticed that some recently published new OCR tools that I tested out, they sometimes, even if, regardless of whether they switch the alignment, sometimes they switch the order of the lines, which I think is interesting. So maybe because the computer doesn't know where to start reading this, or I don't know why, but sometimes they end up switching up the lines. The other issue is character variation. Now, if you work with non-modern texts, then character variation is something that you will likely encounter because classical Chinese texts often include more characters than what's ubiquitously used in the 21st century. And since not every script and not every character in every script has been encoded in Unicode, this is what can lead to the counter outcome that I showed you in the prologue. And then we have the reading aids, or these miniature marks that I circled in the text, which are placed next to the main body of the text. And these facilitate the reordering of the characters in the course of reading to match the word order of the Japanese language, which vastly differs from the grammatical structures of Chinese. So basically, when the Japanese adopted and adapted Chinese characters, they were not able to write Japanese just as it is, because if you want to read this as a Chinese text, you can go character by character, but if you want to read this in Japanese, you have to switch the order of the characters at some point because the word order is different. And sometimes they even, there are different types of reading aids. So these ones mostly just refer to the character order, but sometimes they also put the suffixes there that you have to put after the character that refers to a verb, so you know how to read this in Japanese. So yeah, this is what makes reading Kanbun difficult even for a human being, much as for a computer. So this is something that you encounter in a Japanese text. You wouldn't find this in a Chinese text because you don't have to change the order of the characters. So usually if I encounter a Kanbun text, I tend to read it both in Chinese and in Japanese, and just to make sure that I understand everything correctly. Now, the problem with these reading aids from the perspective of OCR is that many OCR software interpret these supplementary characters as integral parts of the text, often leading to confusing results and the need for substantial manual correction. Now, as I said, I recently tested out some new OCR tools, mainly paid services, I should say, that automatically omit these reading aids, which is interesting, because one could argue that we don't need this because they don't necessarily add new content to the meaning of the text, so you don't necessarily need that. But at the same time, if you want to have like a really truly authentic version of the original text, then we could have a discussion whether or not we actually need these reading aids to remain there. Now, and the fourth point that I want to mention are the commentaries. Now, commentaries are not Japan-specific, so if you look at Chinese dynastic histories, you can find similar examples, like these written with smaller characters, and this is something that you can find in historical works for the most part. And this text, the Dainihonshi, the History of Great Japan, which was compiled between the mid-17th to the early 20th century, so it took 250 years to finish this, mostly written in Kanbun, by the Mito school, initiated by Tokugawa Mitsukuni, the second daimyo or feudal lord of the Mito domain. So the goal here was to emulate the structural and stylistic features of Chinese dynastic histories. So it's no surprise that they also use this, so the commentaries consistently, where the authors mentioned the works that they used as reference works. So they had a similar function compared to present-day footnotes, and they also wrote them with smaller characters. Now, this commentary here is quite short. It only includes a work title, but the problem here is that sometimes these footnotes that are longer, they are usually squeezed into the space of a single column. So there are two lines, dual lines, in the space of one single column, and this is why this reduces the size of the text in these commentaries, resulting in a tendency of most OCR software to treat two neighboring characters as one. So this can also cause some fuzzy results. Yeah. But I want to emphasize that this example is part of an individual project. So this is something that I experimented alone when I was at the University of Chicago, and I was lucky because the university has subscription for some paid services for OCR, and yet I was never able to achieve more than 70% of accuracy. But I can imagine that some institutional or larger collaborative initiatives with more resources and manpower, they can achieve somewhat higher degrees of accuracy, although I would say that most software employed by scholars were not designed with pre-modern Asian scripts in mind. All right, and one more thing is that because of the lack of OCR software that can truly and effectively work for non-Latin scripts, especially in an East Asian context, my goal is to remedy this one way or the other by creating text recognition tools that can be used not just for my own project cluster purposes, but for the broader public as well, because having openly accessible tools is particularly important because this might be the only option for many users, globally speaking, with limited resources to digitize certain pieces of their textual heritage. And here, the added difficulty, as I said, is the problem that not every script and not every character of certain scripts have been encoded in Unicode, which makes the digitization and processing of such text extremely challenging, as for example, Deborah Anderson also notes in her contribution to the recent edited volume, Global Language Justice, where she explains the mechanisms and practical challenges of the encoding process as she talks about the script encoding initiative. Now, let's say that we managed to make our sources machine readable one way or the other. The next step would be to proceed to text analysis most of the times. Now, this can be approached from multiple perspectives because this is an overarching theme too, but here I will focus on a project that I've been a part of, which constitutes a useful example, I think, to showcase what it means to conduct text analysis in non-Latin scripts. And maybe you can relate to these two if I show some concrete examples. So the project was titled, as again this was mentioned in the introduction to, New Languages for NLP, Building Linguistic Diversity in the Digital Humanities. And this is a year-long initiative or institute project organized mainly by Princeton University and Daria, with Haverford College and the Library of Congress Labs as cooperating partners, with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, the raison d'etre behind this project was related to challenges in NLP. So the goal was to diversify natural language processing by increasing the number of languages and scripts represented in the SPACY library, because out of the thousands of languages that exist in the world, only less than 100 are represented in SPACY at the moment. So this is what we wanted to remedy. And here my special thanks go to Huang Zuhong, first of all, who digitized and made available multiple Japanese pre-modern historical works that are out of copyright, including 35 to 40% of the Dainihonshi that I needed. And he apparently used the same OCR software that I experimented with at first, but stopped halfway through due to the large amount of manual corrections that was needed. But the available amount of text was already enough and made it possible for me to participate in this Princeton project where we already needed to have machine-readable texts. So this is already a form of collaboration in a sense on a smaller scale, because as you will see in this process, there were certain things that would not have been possible if I had to do this entirely on my own. Now, the Institute involved 10 language teams with people of diverse backgrounds such as history, literature, and computational linguistics, and they covered a variety of different languages from Quechua and Yoruba and Kannada, classical Arabic, Ottoman Turkish, and what else, Old Chinese, and then there was me representing Kambun as a one-person team. And as I said, the goal was to train NLP models to contribute to each team's project and research questions, and at the same time to diversify NLP linguistically speaking. And here my special thanks also go to Nick Budak, who currently works at Stanford University as a software developer, and he was also a part of the Old Chinese team and one of the organizers of this project. And he helped me proceed at some major milestones when the available tools did not work for Kambun. So oftentimes we had to tweak certain algorithms that already work for classical Chinese and experiment to see if it worked for Kambun. Now, I focus mainly on named entity recognition, and the goal was to train a model that can recognize work titles in the commentaries of the Dainihonshi, because I argued that any shift throughout the 250-year-long period when it was compiled, the consistent references to a variety of source materials in the commentaries would help us get a better sense of how historical consciousness and how the author's approach to the meaning of history and history writing and authenticity may have changed over time. And I claim that the inclusion or disappearance of reference works in these commentaries can help us examine the shifting meaning of history and the historical consciousness of the compilers between the mid-17th and the early 20th century. So basically I placed a scholarly group, the Mito School, that's been underrepresented in the existing scholarship. So they have been marginalized. Kambun has been marginalized in DH, and commentaries, which are often considered to be secondary in the text, again, marginalized. I placed all these into the spotlight. Now, let me give you some insight into the actual workflow, because again, this is something that I often mention to people, that yes, we have some difficulties and challenges doing it, but a lot of times people just don't know what this means in practice. So I thought I would give you a sense of what this actually looked like that I did for a year. So much of this work consisted of annotating texts that we had to use in order to feed into the model. Now, I have used two platforms, Inception and Katma, for the purpose. I started with Katma because I was initially interested in also annotating larger blocks of text, not just words. And as a side note, I would mention that Katma is actually a very humanist-friendly platform. So it allows people to annotate whatever they want quite easily, and you can also change the name tags very smoothly. So it's much easier than on Inception, I would say. However, for the purposes of this year-long project, the default standard platform that we use for annotation was Inception. So in the following, I'm going to talk about that. Now, in order to be able to use Inception, this is the interface for that. So here you can already see an issue that happened because we had to generate a specific type of file, conlu files for the purpose, and we used a platform called Cadet that helped us generate these files. Now, Cadet was very effective for a number of languages, but not for all Chinese and Kambun. Why? Because these languages, and actually this is true for modern Chinese and Japanese too, that there is no white space in the text. Now, why is this a problem? Because if you don't segment the text, then the computer will not know where the words are or where a sentence ends, because a lot of times in non-modern texts, it's not just that there is no white space between the words, there are no punctuation marks either. So basically, it's often up to the reader to decide where a sentence begins and ends, and this can become a basis for debate in the existing scholarship too, because scholars may interpret the same text differently. Now, in the printed version of the Dainihonshi that I used, which was printed in the mid-1920s, they already applied certain punctuation marks, as you can see here. And yet, as you can see, without segmentation, the computer considered an entire sentence as one word, even though there were punctuation marks between it. Now, so obviously this was not the right way to handle the situation, so we tried to segment the text, and what you do oftentimes in classical Chinese, and we try to experiment with classical Chinese models to see how much they can be applicable to Kambun. So we segmented the text character by character, because that's what you do a lot of times in classical Chinese, because there, in a non-modern context, one character mostly referred to one meaning and one syllable, so roughly speaking. This is not entirely the same in the case of Kambun, but we still try to use this pattern to see what happens. Now, this is what happened after segmentation. So Cadet also inserted these underscores between the characters. So again, this was not the right way to do. So eventually what happened was that Nick, whom I already mentioned, he created a separate Colab platform for me as a sort of workaround solution and an alternative for Cadet, so I could generate these files, and that was based on classical Chinese too, added with UD Kambun. So, and by the way, here's perhaps the moment when I should mention Yasuoka Koichi's name, who's one of the very few scholars who have worked on Kambun too. So UD Kambun, and then generally, so anything that's related to NLP that can be used for classical Chinese and Kambun in a Japanese context is something that's somehow related to his work. So, and after, so once I started using this alternative platform, I was able to generate the kind of files that I needed to even start to annotate the text. So, and this is what happened. So this Colab platform also came with the advantage that it added part of speech text to the text. And that was interesting because I was mostly interested in named entity recognition. But it was nice to see and interesting to think about what the computer actually associated the different characters with. Because in classical Chinese in general, so a character can have multiple functions. So it's not a set meaning, so it can be a verb, it can be a noun, depending on the context. So it was interesting to see what it associates the different characters with. Now, and and for this, actually, so once I started doing the annotation, I focused on, as I said, the titles of historical works that were used by the compilers, and they mentioned these in the commentaries. And to some extent, I also annotated names, and so personal names and location names. And even though for my current purposes, for the purposes of my project cluster, the titles of the works were mostly relevant, but I also annotated most texts for persons and locations for higher accuracy, and to prepare annotations in advance for potential future projects where I might use them, and also for the purposes of experimentation to some extent. Now, and as you can maybe see, so the titles, so these work titles were consistently annotated by me as other, because in Inception changing the tag names was a little bit more difficult, so we just opted for other. And eventually we changed it to work of art later on. Now, let me show you some challenges that occurred along the way. So this is also far from smooth. So here, for example, you can see that this is a good example for automatically created tags in Inception. Now, this is something that would be a happy outcome for most of the times, because after you annotate a certain amount of text, you would like to train the software. You would want the tool itself to be able to recognize these terms on its own. And this is what happened actually. So the tool started to learn some patterns, and that was nice. But the problem was that it consistently added the following character or punctuation mark to the automatically tagged words. Here, by the way. Here you can see an example. So this is the Heike Monogatari. So it's a medieval war tale, Japanese war tale. And here, so this is all we needed, the 4 characters, but it just automatically added the comma that came afterwards. And by the way, in the OCR version of the Dainihonshi, so the commentaries were indicated with brackets, by the way. So this was, I did not remove the punctuation marks from the text because it did not really impact the annotation process. In fact, they even helped me to identify where to pay attention to, because so these works of art, these were mentioned in the commentaries, and the commentaries were indicated with brackets, so it was just easier for me. So I had to manually correct this and cut out the commas that came afterwards. So it didn't actually make my situation easier when the tool started to learn. Now the next one, erroneous characters. Now this was mostly an OCR related issue, but this, again, this is something that can impact the accuracy of the model because the computer will likely treat these titles as separate works. Now this is something that this problem could not be solved in Inception, so I had to go back to the original text to change this. But again, this is something, of course, you need to be familiar with the text that you're working with, but if you work with a large amount of text, then this is bound to happen. Randomly divided lines and sentences. So, like I said, I did not remove the punctuation marks, and I thought that this would help Inception because each line was supposed to refer to one sentence. However, what often happened was that sometimes Inception randomly divided the sentences, sometimes by cutting a title in the middle, which happened, for example, here. So the beginning of the title was in the first line and the end was in the second, and there was no way of connecting the 2 lines. So this is what I ended up doing, was that I used the other part tag, and eventually that was a way to indicate that those belong together, and that was, again, something that we had to change to work of art later on. So as you can see, this is about finding workaround solution after workaround solution to make things work that could actually require much less effort if you work with a modern English text, for example. Now, eventually, turning off the recommendation feature in Inception solved most of these challenges, and Nick, in the meantime, also made some modifications to the Colab platform. So afterwards, when I generated more and more conlu files to feed into the model, for example, we ended up not adding the part of speech layer to the files, and that made it easier and faster for me to generate these conlu files. And at the same time, so the random division of sentences became somehow less of a problem, even though we were just not able to solve it otherwise. And but one more thing is that, so this also meant that I had to deal with this automatically added commas less often, so that I mentioned before. So this problem emerged less frequently, but this also meant that I couldn't train the model. So basically I had to do everything manually, and I couldn't expect the tool to learn anything. So this again added more effort, time, and energy to this process. All that being said, the model training was eventually successful, and we managed to train a model that can recognize works of art with 90% of accuracy, and this is something that seems promising, but the erroneous characters in the text and the frequent abbreviation of titles, because the compilers often refer to these works of art not by the full title, but just by mentioning 2 or 3 characters from them. And by the way, this is something that we do too in footnotes. So sometimes we would use the entire title for the first appearance, and then we would just abbreviate them. So it's not that surprising in terms of logic, but at the same time, this is something that these authors in Mito also did, and this is something that, of course, from a computational perspective can present some challenges, so the computer may not realize that these abbreviated titles refer to the same thing as the full title. So this can also distort the effectiveness of the model. At the same time, I also wanted to create a visualization to create some sort of like an aggregate visualization of the content that we found in the Dainihonshi, basically the frequency of the work titles appearing in the different scrolls of the work. And I'm showing you only a snippet because the full visualization will be part of my book project, so you're welcome to look at it in full when it's out. So, but I think this is already enough to showcase what this visualization was really about. And here, special credits are due to Olivia Vane, former information designer at the British Library, and who I think still currently works as an information designer at The Economist. And I coincidentally ran into a visualization that she created for a corpus from the British Library, and I reached out to the British Library, and they kindly pointed me to the code that Olivia Vane made available. So this is a D3JS-based bespoke visualization that we used as an inspiration to create this visualization for my project. And and one thing that I would mention here is that this is all beautiful, but as I mentioned at the beginning, all this was based on what's currently available in a machine-readable format from the Dainihonshi, which is 35 to 40% of the text. However, for my book, I needed the entire data set because I wanted to analyze any kind of shift and change in the text. So this amount of text was not sufficient for my purposes. And so what I did eventually was that I spent part of my stay at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, where I was doing a research trip with funding from the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz. And there I was able to access the print version of the Dainihonshi, and I focused on those volumes that have not been OCR'd, and I manually and literally by hand collected the work titles from the commentaries of those texts that have not been OCR'd. And then I created a database out of those, and that's something that was connected to the already existing data set, so we can create the full visualization. So I guess this workflow showcases the reality of making DH work for non-Latin scripts, and also how far one can get through collaboration, even on a smaller scale. And finally, so after these Kanban-based examples, I thought in Act 3, we would zoom out a little bit so I can introduce some existing initiatives that aim to raise awareness of the realities and challenges of making DH work for under-resourced languages and scripts, not only East Asian languages, by the way, and to eventually achieve tangible outcomes through finding practical solutions so people don't need to do what I had to do in my project anymore in the future. So here I will revisit the research collective, first of all, whom I've been working with and whom I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. So as I said, Cosima Wagner, David Riesli, and Cornelis van Lith. And well, we started working together in 2020. And when we all participated in the Disrupting Digital Monolingualism conference organized by King's College London. And we started by conducting a status quo survey. And we had this ambitious goal, and we still have this goal, to establish a sort of requirement profile. It's essentially a list of minimal functional specifications for platforms to be accessible for multilingual DH practitioners. And this is something that could contribute to the future improvement of research infrastructures. Now, as we progressed, we also became aware that even though our experience may be quite specific, but the kind of problems and issues that we're talking about are actually, they are indicating much larger social issues. And we also realized that this is not exclusively the experience of scholars in the humanities, but also the reality of a great number of people in general in the world. For example, communities trying to preserve their cultural and textual heritage, but many of them encounter challenges due to financial difficulties and the lack of access to tools and infrastructures. Eventually, we turned to UX methods as a non-standard means, more specifically data-driven user persona profiles that we created based on the data we collected through surveys, workshops, open forum sessions, and our network. And we consider user profiles as a means to humanize the challenges and realities we're talking about and to bring the experience of these people, whether they are PhD students, assistant professors, full professors, librarians, independent scholars, or academic technology specialists who all face different challenges one way or the other. And essentially, they constituted the basis for the 6 user profiles that we created for starters. So we don't claim that these 6 groups cover the entire DH community, but I thought, or we thought that these are useful for starters. And we published this data set on Zenodo, as you can see. And then we also enacted these personas as part of interviews we performed at the conference DH Unbound in 2022 within the framework of an alternative session. And this confirmed our claim that user profiles have the capacity and power to help people understand the community. And we have even taken a step further in this very non-standard process and recently published an open access paper in Digital Studies, Le Champ Numérique, to capture shared experiences of multilingual DH practitioners, recognizing their potential limitations to appear as isolated cases of multilinguality. And we followed the example of the so-called living lab method, and we put them into a dialogue with each other. So basically, this resulted in a fictional plenary, so essentially a fictional roundtable discussion of these personas. So we basically we made these personas speak or let them speak, but and also provided not only just the contextual analysis of this, but even the actual transcript of this fictional plenary that we think should happen for real to narrativize multilinguality. And so it's like a fictional roundtable, a fictional conference where we put these 6 personas into a conversation and let them share how they would reply to the moderator's questions, essentially. And we have concluded and confirmed that the problems which could be seen as isolated edge cases are actually widely shared, both among users with the same language sets and across user groups using different languages. And we also claimed, and I quote, "There's a specific role to be played by the digital humanist in describing and modeling the design of workflows that assume multilinguality and multiscriptural and multidirectional practices. This work cannot be left only to the tech industry and commercial interests," end quote. And since then, we discussed this with the participants of our DH 2023 workshop in Graz, and currently formulating 2 papers for publication based upon the writing sprint that we collectively produced there, which is yet another form of collaboration. And all this points to the infrastructural level and the broader scholarly community. So here I would also mention some initiatives that I've been a part of related to some infrastructures, such as Daria, where, first of all, I'm on the editorial team of the Open Methods meta blog, so from the perspective, and if we think about how these initiatives approach the question of multilingualism and multilinguality, then from the perspective of Open Methods, I could say that this highlights digital tools and methods. So basically we already published content with a critical introduction attached to them. And this can be written either from someone from the editorial team or from an external contributor. And the introductions are generally in English, but the featured projects themselves are not necessarily. In fact, we encourage the inclusion of non-Anglophone projects, and we're making a conscious effort to diversify the linguistic coverage in this regard. Well, of course, there's a finite number of languages that the editorial team members speak, but it's already quite a broad repertoire. And another thing I would mention is, I already mentioned at the beginning too, so I'm co-founder and chair of the Daria Multilingual DH working group together with Marussia Bednarkiewicz at the University of Tübingen. And about this working group, what I can say is that here our goal is to enhance digitally enabled research in under-resourced languages and scripts, to create a linguistically more inclusive DH environment beyond, but also including English. So we are quite inclusive in this regard, and we don't discriminate against English at all. And our, now it's just, I don't want to make it seem like we discriminate against English. Everything is beyond English, no. So of course, everyone is welcome. And we have a very diverse group of members in terms like linguistic background and professional background. And for us, it's always been important to not only raise awareness of the realities of like-minded scholars, but to also achieve tangible results through concrete and practical initiatives. And as part of this endeavor, I would mention 2 projects. The first is the Living Bibliography of Multilingual DH. Now, this one is an ongoing initiative on Zotero, and this is something that's that we are doing together. And if you're interested in contributing, then let me know, and I'll be happy to give you access to. You can add your suggested items to it. So here, basically, what we're doing is that so the gap that we want to fill is related to this conundrum that there are a variety of bibliographies on the internet that claim to collect the existing scholarship of DH very in a generic sense, but I noticed that many of these fail to include anything that's based on non-Anglophone materials. And this is the gap that we want to fill by collecting the existing scholarship in multilingual DH, and we are very inclusive in terms of language and genre. So essentially everything that's about the conceptual considerations about multilingual DH, or anything that's about, that's been published in a language other than English, or it can be in English too if it's based on sources other than English, or English and something else. So anything goes in this regard. We're even collecting syllabi, by the way, for DH courses that aim to be linguistically inclusive. So, and this is something that's going to be soon featured on the Daria Tools and Services platform. And the other project is an upcoming workshop, creating, managing, and archiving textual corpora in under-resourced languages, which is something that we are organizing together with the Daria Research Data Management Working Group, and we want funding from Daria for the purpose, and we have the recently funded at-home multilingual DH special interest group as a cooperating partner. This is going to take place at the University of Hamburg in early September and online. And here the promised deliverable is a workflow that's going to be published in the SSH Open Marketplace and potentially in other venues as well. And here what we want to collaboratively create is essentially a workflow that people working with a variety of different sources in different languages can use to create and manage their own corpora for textual analysis. And about we want to think about, different segments and different perspectives that one needs to think about if they have non-Anglophone materials, for example, especially non-Latin scripts. And I would also mention I'm happy to see that more and more working groups at Daria are also tackling multilingual perspectives, because this can be a basis for collaboration. So I could mention the Bibliodata Working Group that recently published a paper on open bibliographical data workflows, and the ELDA Working Group, the Ethics and Legality Working Group, that has a multilingual consent form wizard. But I could also mention the OPERAs and other infrastructures multilingualism special interest group that focuses on translation to disrupt the dominance of English in academic publishing. So all these can be productive ways to approach this problem, and I feel like there's still a long way to go, as you've seen in the examples that I showed you. These are very recent examples, so there's still a long way to go, but I'm optimistic about a promising future. And I will finish with a coda in lieu of a conclusion. So I recently attended a conference in Passau, the DHD conference, the Digital Humanities Conference of the German-speaking areas. And there was a roundtable on multilingual perspectives in DH, on Mehrsprachigkeit. And one of the panelists, Frederik Elvert, mentioned at some point that maybe we should reconsider the meaning of cutting edge. And this is something that made me think a lot. And what he meant was not that we should lower quality standards at all. What he meant is that we should recognize the sheer difference between making DH work for different languages and scripts. And because what's already possible for English, especially modern English, may require a lot more effort to achieve in other languages and scripts, as you may have seen in the examples that I've shown you. So, or not just English, but other better served languages. And if we take this a step further, this can lead to the question of research assessment too, which is gaining momentum in a European context as well, and how language as a phenomenon can and should impact the revision of these systems. So if you work with a completely under-resourced language and you train a model, or you create a tool that can be useful not only for you but for a broader community, that should also be recognized as valuable and cutting-edge research output. But this is something, whatever this is that we're talking about, I hope it became also clear that this is something that should be done together. So the importance of collaboration is something that I cannot emphasize enough, because most of these problems can be solved most effectively with the concerted efforts and representation of both the technical and the humanistic side, and both of them should be there equally. All right, I will stop there and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.